Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Bonechill. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. You won't want to miss what's coming. Also tell me, where in the world are you watching from? And is it dark outside yet?
You know, there's something most people don't understand about death. They think it's an ending, a final chapter, a closing door. But those of us who work in the funeral business, we know better. Death isn't a period at the end of a sentence. It's more like a comma, a pause before something else begins. And sometimes that something else doesn't stay buried. I've been preparing bodies for over 20 years now. I've seen families weep over empty caskets because there wasn't enough left to bury. I've closed the eyes of children who never got to see their first day of school. I've dressed the murdered, the suicidal, the forgotten. But the stories I'm about to share with you aren't about the dead. They're about the living, and the terrible gifts the departed sometimes leave behind. You see, when someone dies, they don't always take everything with them. Sometimes they leave traces, imprints, pieces of themselves embedded in the objects they treasured most. And those objects, they find their way back into the world, carrying with them powers that should have stayed buried 6 feet under. What scares you more? The thought that there's nothing after death, or the possibility that there's something, and it's been trying to reach you through the things the dead once held dear? Before we begin tonight's journey into the shadows, I need you to do something for me. If these stories make your skin crawl the way they should, hit that like button. It tells me you're ready for more. Subscribe to Dr. Bonechill. Help us reach 10,000 souls who aren't afraid to stare into the darkness. And when we're done, tell me in the comments, have you ever inherited something that felt wrong? Because after tonight, you might start paying closer attention to those family heirlooms gathering dust in your attic. Now let me tell you about the first time I truly understood that the dead don't always rest in peace. My name is David, and I used to think inheritance was a blessing. Growing up poor in a cramped apartment above my mother's failing bakery, I dreamed of the day some distant relative would leave me something valuable, maybe enough to change my life, to lift me out of the endless cycle of overdue bills and sleepless nights. I should have been more careful what I wished for. Uncle Eugene died on a Tuesday in March. I barely knew the man. He was my father's brother, a recluse who lived alone in a Victorian house on Maple Street that always seemed to be shrouded in shadow even on the brightest days. The funeral was small, just me, a handful of his former colleagues from the university where he'd taught history, and the funeral director, a thin man with kind eyes who kept glancing at me with what looked like pity. Eugene had been a professor of medieval studies, obsessed with ancient texts and forgotten knowledge. His house reflected this passion. Every room was stuffed floor to ceiling with books, manuscripts, and peculiar artifacts he'd collected over decades of research. The place smelled of old paper and something else, something I couldn't quite identify, but that made my nose wrinkle and my stomach turn slightly. The lawyer handling Eugene's estate was efficient and unsympathetic. I inherited everything: the house, the books, and a collection of what he termed academic curiosities. Most of it would need to be sold, of course. I couldn't afford to maintain the property, and I had no use for medieval manuscripts written in languages I couldn't even pronounce. But as I wandered through the house, taking inventory and trying to decide what might have value, I found myself drawn to Eugene's study. It was different from the other rooms, more organized, more deliberate. His desk sat in the center, a massive oak piece that dominated the space, and on it lay a single object that seemed to pulse with some inner importance. It was a magnifying glass, but not the kind you'd find in any store. The handle was carved from some dark wood I didn't recognize, inlaid with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The lens itself was unusually large and perfectly clear, set in a frame of what appeared to be silver, though it had a strange, oily sheen that shifted in the light. Next to it was a note in Eugene's careful handwriting. For David, use wisely. See what others cannot. I picked it up, and the moment my fingers closed around the handle, I felt a jolt of electricity run up my arm. Not painful exactly, but startling. Like touching a doorknob after walking across carpet, but deeper somehow, as if the shock had traveled all the way to my bones. The magnifying glass was heavier than it looked, with a perfect balance that made it feel almost alive in my hand. I held it up to examine a page of text on Eugene's desk, and the letters beneath the lens seemed to swim and shift, rearranging themselves into patterns that made my head spin. I set it down quickly, telling myself it was just the stress of the day. The strange atmosphere of the house, the grief I hadn't yet processed. But I took it with me when I left. Back in my small apartment, the magnifying glass sat on my kitchen table like an accusation. For 3 days I avoided looking at it directly, though I was always aware of its presence. A dark weight in my peripheral vision that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. On Thursday night, unable to sleep, I finally picked it up, again. I told myself I was just curious about its craftsmanship, maybe hoping it was valuable enough to sell. I held it over a newspaper lying on the table, adjusting the distance until the text came into sharp focus. But the words I saw through the lens weren't the ones printed on the page. Where the headline should have read, "City Council approves new budget," I saw instead, "Sarah Morrison will die at 3:17 a.m." I jerked the magnifying glass away, my heart hammering. The newspaper showed its normal text again, budget discussions, traffic reports, weather forecasts. But when I looked through the lens once more, the message was still there, burned into my vision like an afterimage. Sarah Morrison will die at 3:17 a.m. Sarah Morrison was my downstairs neighbor, a sweet elderly woman who always smiled when we passed in the hallway and sometimes brought me cookies she'd baked when she made too many. I looked at my clock. 2:43 a.m. I should have dismissed it as hallucination, stress, maybe some kind of optical illusion caused by the unusual lens. But something deep in my gut, some primal instinct that had kept humans alive for millennia, was screaming that this was real. I found myself standing outside Sarah's door at 3:15, my ear pressed to the wood, listening for any sound from within. The building was old and poorly soundproofed. I could usually hear her television, her footsteps, the whistle of her tea kettle, but there was only silence. At exactly 3:17, I heard a soft thud, like something heavy falling to the floor. I called. The police told them I'd heard what sounded like someone collapsing, that I was worried about my elderly neighbor. They found Sarah on her kitchen floor, still in her nightgown. Heart attack, they said. Quick and relatively painless. She'd probably died instantly. I should have been relieved that she hadn't suffered. Instead, I felt hollow, scooped out, as if something essential had been carved from my chest. Because I had known. Somehow, impossibly, I had known. Over the following weeks, I tried to convince myself it had been a coincidence. Sarah was 78 years old with a history of heart problems. Her death, while tragic, wasn't exactly unexpected. The magnifying glass was just an old academic tool, nothing more. The message I thought I'd seen was a product of stress and an overactive imagination, but I kept testing it. I would hold the lens over newspapers, magazines, even random pieces of paper, and more often than not, I would see things that weren't there, or rather things that weren't there yet. Fragments of future headlines, snippets of conversations that wouldn't happen for days, names and dates and events that made no sense until they came to pass. Thompson's Market will burn Sunday night. Jenny Walsh's car will be stolen. The mayor will resign in disgrace. And each prediction came true with terrifying precision. I began to understand that the magnifying glass didn't just show me the future, it showed me death, not always directly, but death was woven through every vision like a black thread through a tapestry. Thompson's Market burned because a vagrant knocked over a space heater while trying to stay warm, dying in the flames. Jenny Walsh's car was stolen by a teenager who crashed it into a tree 20 minutes later, breaking his neck. The mayor's resignation came after his son's overdose made headlines. The glass fed on tragedy, revealed itself through suffering, and the more I used it, the more clearly I could see the approaching darkness that surrounded everyone I encountered. But knowledge without the power to change anything is a special kind of hell. I tried warning people, tried to intervene, but how do you tell someone their loved one is going to die without sounding insane? How do you explain that you know their future because you're looking at it through a cursed lens inherited from a dead uncle? The few times I tried, people looked at me like I was having a breakdown. When I persisted, they stopped talking to me altogether. I became that guy, the one who said weird, uncomfortable things, who showed up at inappropriate moments with warnings nobody wanted to hear. And still, the deaths continued. Still, the magnifying glass showed me horror after horror that I was powerless to prevent. The worst part wasn't the visions themselves. It was the realization that my Uncle Eugene had known exactly what he was giving me. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a burden, a curse passed down from one generation to the next. Somewhere in his collection of manuscripts and ancient texts, he had found references to this thing, had understood its power, and had spent decades watching people die through its lens. The note he'd left, use wisely, see what others cannot, wasn't instruction, it was mockery. I tried to destroy the magnifying glass. I threw it against the wall, but it didn't break. I tried to burn it, but the flames wouldn't touch it. I buried it in my backyard, but the next morning it was sitting on my kitchen table again as if it had never been gone. Eventually I accepted that it would always be with me, this window into humanity's approaching doom. I stopped trying to warn people, stopped attempting to change what I saw. Instead, I became a witness to the inevitable, a recorder of tragedies that hadn't yet occurred. But sometimes, late at night, when the weight of all that future suffering becomes too much to bear, I catch myself wondering, who will I leave this to when my time comes? Who will inherit this terrible gift when I'm the one being prepared for burial? And in my darkest moments, I hold the magnifying glass up to the mirror and try to see my own end reflected in its surface. But the glass, it seems, has a sense of humor. It shows me everyone's death but my own, leaving me to wonder if my punishment is to carry this knowledge forever, never knowing when my own release will come. The dead don't rest in peace, and now neither do I. I've been working at Riverside Funeral Home for 15 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen every kind of grief, every way a family could fall apart when death came calling. I was wrong. The Henley family brought their daughter Emily to us on a cold October morning. She was only 7 years old, taken by leukemia after a 2-year battle that had drained not just her small body but her parents' savings, their hope, and very nearly their sanity. Mrs. Henley could barely stand during our consultation, held upright by her husband's trembling arm as he tried to maintain some semblance of composure for both of them. Emily had been their only child, their miracle baby born after years of trying. Her room, they told me through tears, was filled with music boxes, dozens of them, collected over her short life. She loved the delicate melodies, the tiny dancing figures, the way they seemed to bring magic into the sterile hospital rooms where she'd spent so many months. She always said the music helped her sleep, Mrs. Henley whispered, clutching a tissue that had long since become useless. Even when the pain was bad, she'd ask us to wind up her favorite one, the little ballerina in the pink tutu. The funeral service was devastating in the way that only a child's funeral can be. The small white casket looked impossibly tiny, surrounded by flowers and teddy bears, and I had to step outside twice to compose myself. Even after all these years, children's services still hit me like a physical blow. But it was what happened afterward that changed everything. 3 days after Emily's burial, Mr. Henley returned to the funeral home. He looked like he'd aged a decade since I'd last seen him. His hair seemed grayer, his eyes hollow and unfocused. He carried a small box wrapped in Emily's favorite purple blanket. "We can't keep it in the house anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, my wife, she can't stop winding it up. She sits in Emily's room for hours just listening to it play over and over. She's not eating, not sleeping. She thinks—" He paused, swallowing hard. "She thinks Emily is still there somehow." He unwrapped the blanket to reveal a music box I recognized from Emily's hospital room. It was beautiful in an antique sort of way. Carved wooden base with intricate roses painted in soft pastels, topped with a small glass dome. Inside, a tiny porcelain ballerina in a pink tutu stood frozen on one pointed toe, waiting for the music to bring her to life. "I know this sounds crazy," Mr. Henley continued, But sometimes late at night we hear it playing even when nobody's wound it up. And the ballerina, she moves differently now. More deliberate, like she's trying to tell us something. I wanted to dismiss it as grief-induced hallucination, the kind of desperate magical thinking that often follows the loss of a child. But there was something in his eyes, a terror that went beyond normal mourning, that made me pause. "Would you mind if I kept it here for a while?" I asked. "Just until your wife feels ready to have it back home." The relief on his face was immediate and profound. "Thank you, I know it sounds insane, but I swear that thing has been different since Emily." He couldn't finish the sentence. That night, I brought the music box home with me. I live alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Never married, no children of my own, just me and the quiet that sometimes feels more like loneliness than peace. I set the music box on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what had frightened Mr. Henley so badly. It looked innocent enough. The ballerina was beautifully crafted, her tiny painted face serene and sweet. The music box itself showed signs of age. The paint was slightly faded in places, and there were small scratches on the wooden base that spoke of years of loving handling. I wound the key and watched as the ballerina began to turn, her movements perfectly synchronized with the tinkling melody of Fur-Elise. It was hypnotic in the way that music boxes always are, that combination of visual and auditory rhythm that seems to bypass the conscious mind and speak directly to something deeper. The music played for exactly 2 minutes and 17 seconds before the spring wound down and the ballerina came to rest. Nothing unusual, nothing frightening, just a child's treasured toy playing out its simple mechanical purpose. But that night, I woke to the sound of music. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The melody was faint, barely audible, like it was coming from very far away. But as I lay there in the darkness, fully awake now, I realized it was coming from downstairs, from the kitchen, from the music box. I crept down the stairs, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. The house was dark except for the streetlight filtering through the front windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me as I moved. The music grew clearer as I approached the kitchen, that same delicate rendition of Fur-Elise that I'd heard earlier. I flipped on the light and froze. The ballerina was dancing, spinning slowly in her glass dome just as she had when I'd wound the key. But I hadn't wound it. I was certain of that. I'd listened to it play completely through before going to bed, watched the ballerina come to a stop, heard the final notes fade into silence. Yet here she was, turning and turning, her tiny arms raised, in perfect ballet position, her painted smile somehow different than I remembered. Wider, more knowing. I approached the table slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. As I got closer, the music seemed to change. Not the melody itself, but something in the quality of it. It sounded sadder somehow, more desperate, like a plea being repeated over and over. The ballerina's face was turned toward me now, and I could swear her eyes were looking directly into mine, not just pointed in my direction, but actually seeing me, tracking my movement as I circled the table. Her smile had definitely changed. What had seemed sweet and innocent in the daylight now looked almost predatory, as if she were sharing some terrible secret that only she understood. I reached for the music box, intending to stop the mechanism, but the moment my fingers touched the wooden base, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the inside of the glass dome. The music slowed, distorting into something that sounded less like Fur-Elise and more like a funeral dirge. And then I heard it, a child's voice, thin and ghostly, singing along with the melody. Not words exactly, but a wordless humming that made my skin crawl and the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I jerked my hand away, and instantly the music returned to normal speed. The frost disappeared, and the temperature rose back to comfortable levels. But the ballerina continued to dance, and her eyes continued to follow me as I backed away from the table. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a dream. a particularly vivid nightmare, brought on by stress and the emotional weight of Emily's funeral. The music box sat silent on my kitchen table, the ballerina frozen in her starting position, everything exactly as it should be. But that evening, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I set up a camera pointed at the music box, determined to document what I was experiencing. Either I would capture evidence of something supernatural, or I would have proof that my grief-soaked mind was playing tricks on me. At 3:17 a.m., I'll never forget that time, the music began. Through the camera's viewfinder, I watched the ballerina come to life, spinning slowly in her dome while that haunting melody filled my kitchen. But this time, as she danced, she began to change. Her pink tutu darkened to deep red, then to black. Her tiny porcelain face grew pale, then gray, then took on the waxy, bloodless appearance of death. Her smile widened until it was a grimace, and her eyes, those painted blue eyes that had seemed so innocent, became dark holes that seemed to pull light into them. The music grew louder, more insistent, and suddenly I understood what I was seeing. This wasn't just a music box anymore. It was a prison, and Emily, sweet 7-year-old Emily, who had loved music and ballet and the sound of tiny melodies in hospital rooms, was trapped inside, trying desperately to communicate with the world she'd been forced to leave behind. The ballerina's movements became more frantic, more desperate. She spun faster and faster, her arms reaching out as if trying to break through the glass that contained her. The music box itself began to vibrate on the table, the painted roses on its base seeming to writhe and twist in the dim light. And then, clear as if she were standing right next to me, I heard Emily's voice. "Help me, please help me. I can't get out. I can't get out." I reached for the music box without thinking, my hands closing around the glass dome. The moment I touched it, visions flooded my mind. Emily in her hospital bed, weak and frightened but still humming along to her favorite music box. Emily taking her last breath while the tiny ballerina danced above her. Emily's spirit, confused and terrified, being drawn into the very object that had brought her comfort in life. The music box had become her anchor to the world, the thing that kept her from moving on to whatever comes next. She was trapped between life and death, caught in an endless loop of that same 2-minute, 17-second melody, watching the world continue without her through eyes that could see but not touch, hear but not speak. I understood then why Mrs. Henley had been so drawn to the music box, why she'd spent hours listening to it play. She had sensed, on some maternal level, that her daughter was still there, still trying to reach her. The box called to those who had loved Emily, promising them one more moment with her, one more chance to see her dance. But it was a cruel promise, offering connection, while ensuring that Emily could never truly rest. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I drove to Emily's grave. The headstone was small and simple, decorated with carved roses that matched those on the music box. I sat in the grass beside it, the music box in my lap, and spoke to Emily as if she were sitting next to me. "I know you're scared," I told her. "I know you don't want to leave your parents, don't want to go somewhere you can't see them anymore. But this isn't living, Emily. This is just existing in between, and it's hurting you. It's hurting your mom and dad, too." I wound the key one final time and watched the ballerina dance. But now, instead of the desperate, frantic movements I'd seen in my kitchen, she moved with grace and acceptance. Her face had returned to its original sweetness, and her eyes looked peaceful rather than terrified. The music played through to its end, and as the final notes faded, I heard Emily's voice one last time. "Thank you." The ballerina came to rest, and I felt something shift in the air around me, a sense of release, of completion, like a held breath finally being exhaled. I buried the music box next to Emily's grave, 6 feet down in the cold earth where it belonged. The groundskeeper thought I was crazy, but he helped me dig anyway. Some things, I told him, need to stay buried. The Henleys never asked for the music box back. A week later, Mrs. Henley called to thank me, though she wasn't sure why. She said she'd been sleeping better, eating again, and while she still missed Emily terribly, the crushing weight of grief had lifted just enough for her to function. She didn't need to know that her daughter's spirit had finally found peace. Some gifts are better left unexplained, but late at night when the funeral home is quiet and I'm alone with the dead, I sometimes think I can hear it, a faint melody carried on the wind, the sound of a little girl's laughter, and the soft whisper of ballet slippers on heavenly floors. Emily is dancing still, but now she's dancing free. I run a small funeral home in the suburbs with my husband James. We've been married for 23 years, and for 20 of those years, we've worked side by side preparing the dead for their final rest. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest. And we've built a good life together, helping families through their darkest hours. I thought I knew everything about marriage, the compromises, the quiet moments, the way two people can share a life so completely that they become extensions of each other. I was wrong about that too. Mrs. Dorothy Kellerman came to us in late November, brought in by her son after dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 89. She'd been a widow for 30 years, he told us, never remarrying after her husband. Walter passed from a heart attack in his 50s. She always said she was still married to him in her heart, her son explained with a sad smile. Never even took off her wedding ring. The ring was beautiful, a simple gold band with a modest diamond that had clearly been worn for decades. The metal was thin from years of wear, the diamond slightly loose in its setting, but it caught the light in a way that spoke of deep, abiding love. Mrs. Kellerman's hands were weathered and spotted with age, but that ring seemed to glow against her pale skin. Her son wanted her buried with it, of course. She'd haunt me if I tried to take it off, he said, and we all laughed, not knowing how prophetic those words would prove to be. But when I tried to remove the ring for cleaning before the viewing, it wouldn't come off. Mrs. Kellerman's fingers had swollen slightly after death, as often happens, and the ring was stuck tight. I tried soap, tried oil, even tried the dental floss trick that usually works in these situations. Nothing. The ring seemed fused to her finger, as if it had grown there over the decades. "We'll have to cut it off," James said, reaching for the ring cutter we kept for situations like this. "No," I said, surprising myself with the vehemence in my voice. "She wore it for 60 years. It stays." James looked at me strangely. It wasn't like me to be sentimental about jewelry, especially when it interfered with our work. But something about that ring, about the way it seemed to belong so completely on Mrs. Kellerman's finger, made the thought of cutting it off feel like a violation. We worked around it, using concealer to cover the slight discoloration where the ring pressed against the skin, adjusting her hands so the ring was visible but not prominent. Mrs. Kellerman looked peaceful in her casket, her wrinkled hands folded over her chest, that gold band catching the soft light of the funeral home's lamps. The viewing went smoothly. Family and friends came to pay their respects, sharing stories of Dorothy's kindness, her legendary apple pie, the way she'd volunteered at the church for 40 years even after Walter died. Several people mentioned the ring, how devoted she'd been to her husband's memory, how romantic it was that she'd never taken it off. But it was during the funeral service that things began to go wrong. I was standing at the back of the chapel, making sure everything was running smoothly, when I noticed something odd. Mrs. Kellerman's hands, which I had carefully positioned with her arms crossed over her chest, had moved. The hand wearing the ring was now extended slightly, as if she were reaching for something. Or someone. I told myself it was settling. Bodies shift sometimes during services as the muscles relax. It happens, though usually not so dramatically. I made a mental note to check the positioning before we closed the casket. But when I approached the casket after the service ended, I froze. The ring was glowing, not brightly, but with a soft, warm light that seemed to come from within the diamond itself. And Mrs. Kellerman's arm was definitely extended now, her ringed hand reaching toward the empty space beside her, as if trying to take someone's hand. "James," I called softly, and he came over, already sensing something was wrong. "What is it?" He started to ask, then stopped when he saw the ring. The glow was faint but unmistakable, pulsing gently like a heartbeat made of light. "Did you see that before?" I whispered. He shook his head, his face pale. We both stood there, staring at Mrs. Kellerman's outstretched hand, at the ring that shouldn't have been glowing, at the impossible situation we'd somehow found ourselves in. The glow faded as we watched, dimming until it looked like normal jewelry again. But Mrs. Kellerman's hand remained extended, and no amount of repositioning could make it stay crossed over her chest. Every time we moved it back, it would slowly drift back to that reaching position. We buried her the next day, and I thought that would be the end of it. But that night, alone in our bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My own wedding ring was glowing. It was subtle at first, just a faint warmth against my skin that I attributed to the hot shower I'd taken. But as I lay in bed next to James, I could see the soft light emanating from the simple gold band I'd worn for 23 years. "James," I whispered, but he was already asleep, exhausted from the long day. I stared at my hand in the darkness, watching the gentle pulse of light from my ring, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. The glow faded after a few minutes, leaving me to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. But over the following days it happened again and again, always at night, always when James was asleep or away, always accompanied by a strange tugging sensation, as if something were trying to pull me in a direction I couldn't identify. I began to notice other things too. The ring felt different on my finger, heavier somehow and warmer than it should have been. Sometimes I caught myself reaching for James even when he wasn't there, my ringed hand extending toward empty space in a gesture that reminded me uncomfortably of Mrs. Kellerman in her casket. A week after the funeral, I was alone in the preparation room, working on an elderly man who'd died of cancer when I heard it, a soft tapping sound like someone knocking on glass. I looked around, trying to locate the source, and realized it was coming from my hand. My wedding ring was tapping against the metal table, moving of its own accord, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like Morse code. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. I jerked my hand away from the table, and the tapping stopped, but the ring continued to pulse with that strange inner light, and I could swear I felt something, a presence, a consciousness, trying to communicate through the metal band around my finger. That night I couldn't stand it anymore. I confronted James in our bedroom, holding out my hand so he could see the glowing ring. "Do you see it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The light?" He looked at my hand, his expression concerned but not alarmed. "Catherine, what light? Are you feeling all right?" I stared at my ring, which looked completely normal under the bedroom lights. No glow, no warmth, no supernatural pulse. Just a simple gold band worn thin by decades of wear. "You don't see anything unusual?" I pressed. "Honey, you've been working too hard. Maybe you should take a few days off, get some rest." But I knew I wasn't imagining things. The ring was changing me, connecting me to something I didn't understand. I began to research the Kellermans, digging through old newspaper archives and county records, trying to understand what had made Dorothy's ring so special. What I found chilled me to the bone. Walter Kellerman hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd died in a car accident, rushing home from a business trip because Dorothy had called him in tears, saying she felt like something terrible was going to happen to him. She'd been right. He'd crashed his car on a curve just 3 miles from their house, dying instantly. But the strangest part was what the police report mentioned almost as an afterthought. Walter's wedding ring had been found 20 feet from the wreckage, as if it had been torn from his finger during the crash. Yet when they prepared his body for burial, the ring was back on his hand. The funeral director at the time had noted it in his records, calling it peculiar, but not unprecedented. Dorothy had insisted that Walter be buried with his ring, just as her son had insisted she be buried with hers. But according to the cemetery records, Walter's grave had been disturbed 3 times over the years, always at night, always by persons unknown, always leaving the grave open but the body untouched. The last disturbance had been exactly 30 years ago, just after Dorothy's death. I understood then what was happening. The rings were connected, bound together by decades of love and devotion. Dorothy's ring had been calling to Walter's, trying to reunite them in death as they had been united in life. And now, somehow, that connection was affecting my own ring, my own marriage. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The rings were showing me what real love looked like. Not the comfortable companionship James and I shared, not the practical partnership we'd built over 2 decades, but the soul-deep connection that transcends death itself. I began to pay attention to my marriage in a way I hadn't in years. I noticed how James and I had grown apart, how we functioned more like business partners than lovers. We slept in the same bed but rarely touched. We worked together, but rarely talked about anything beyond the funeral home. We shared a life, but had somehow stopped sharing ourselves. The ring grew brighter each night, its glow now accompanied by visions. Images of Dorothy and Walter in their younger days, dancing in their living room, holding hands while they walked through the park, the way they looked at each other even after 40 years of marriage. The love between them was so intense, so complete, that it had literally bound their souls together beyond death. My own marriage felt hollow by comparison. One night, unable to sleep, I walked to the cemetery where the Kellermans were buried. It was past midnight, the air cold and still, the headstones casting long shadows in the moonlight. I found their graves easily. They were buried side by side, just as they should have been. But as I approached, I saw something that made me stop. In my tracks, both graves were glowing. Not brightly, but with the same soft, warm light I'd been seeing in my ring. The light pulsed in perfect synchronization, 2 hearts beating as one even in death. I held up my hand and watched as my ring began to glow, in response, pulsing in harmony with the light from the graves. For a moment I felt what Dorothy and Walter had felt, that complete connection, that absolute certainty that I was looking at my other half, the person who made me whole. But it wasn't James I was thinking of. It was the love itself, the possibility of feeling that connected to another human being, that willing to sacrifice everything for their happiness. I knelt beside Dorothy's grave and spoke to her as if she could hear me. "I understand now," I whispered. "You're showing me what I'm missing, aren't you? What James and I have lost." The glow from the graves grew brighter, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. It was approval, encouragement, a gentle push toward the truth I'd been avoiding. I went home and woke James up. We talked until dawn. Really talked for the first time in years. I told him about the ring, about the visions, about how seeing the Kellermans' love had made me realize how far we'd drifted from each other. He listened without judgment, holding my glowing hand in both of his, and when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "I felt it too," he finally said. "The distance between us, I just didn't know how to bridge it." We began that morning to rebuild what we'd lost. It wasn't easy. 20 years of emotional distance doesn't disappear overnight. But we started, small, with conversations over coffee, with walks in the evening, with the simple act of touching each other without purpose beyond connection. The ring's glow grew softer as the weeks passed, as if it approved of our efforts. Sometimes I would catch James looking at me the way Walter had looked at Dorothy in my visions, and my heart would skip in a way it hadn't in years. 3 months later, we renewed our vows in a small ceremony at the church where we'd first been married. As we exchanged rings, the same rings we'd worn for 23 years, I felt the connection snap into place, that soul-deep bond I'd seen between the Kellermans. My wedding ring hasn't glowed since that day. It doesn't need to. I carry that light inside me now, in the love that James and I have rebuilt from the ashes of complacency. Sometimes, when I'm working late at the funeral home, I visit the Kellermans' graves. The glowing has stopped there too, as if they've finally found the peace they were searching for. They taught me that love isn't just about living together, it's about choosing each other, again and again, through all the small deaths that relationships face. The dead don't always rest in peace. But sometimes, if we're lucky, they help the living find their way back to it. I've been an embalmer for 37 years. In that time, I've prepared over 4,000 bodies for burial, each one carrying their own story, their own secrets, their own regrets. I thought I understood death in all its forms: sudden, lingering, peaceful, violent. But I'd never encountered a death that refused to stay in the past. Harold Merchant was 93 when he died, alone in his mansion on Elm Street. The house had been in his family for generations, a sprawling Victorian that had seen better days but still commanded respect from behind its wrought iron gates. Harold had been a successful businessman in his younger years, building a fortune in manufacturing before retiring to become something of a recluse. He had no family left, never married, no children, siblings long dead. His lawyer, a nervous man named Peterson, handled all the arrangements. Simple service, closed casket, burial in the family plot beside parents he'd outlived by 30 years. Mr. Merchant was very specific about one thing, Peterson told me as we discussed the arrangements. He wanted to be buried with his father's pocket watch. It's been in the family for over a century, and he was quite adamant that it go with him. The pocket watch was beautiful, solid gold with intricate engravings covering every surface. The face was pristine white porcelain with Roman numerals, and the hands were delicate works of art in themselves. When I held it up to the light, I could see the craftsmanship that had gone into every detail, from the elaborate chain to the tiny winding crown. But what struck me most was that it was still running. After 3 days in the morgue, with no one to wind it, that watch should have stopped. Pocket watches don't run indefinitely. They need to be wound regularly, usually daily, to keep accurate time. Yet here it was, ticking away steadily, keeping perfect time as if it had just been serviced. Strange, I muttered to myself, holding the watch to my ear. The tick was strong and regular, almost hypnotic in its consistency. I placed it in Harold's vest pocket, following the lawyer's instructions, and began the embalming process. But as I worked, I became increasingly aware of the watch's presence. The ticking seemed to grow louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear in the quiet preparation room. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't keeping time anymore. It was marking time, counting down to something I couldn't identify but that filled me with a growing sense of dread. That night I stayed late to finish Harold's preparation. The funeral home was empty except for me and the dead, the way I preferred when working on difficult cases. But as I put the finishing touches on Harold's appearance, I noticed something that made my hands freeze in mid-motion. The pocket watch was glowing, not brightly, but with a faint golden light that seemed to emanate from within the metal itself. The ticking had grown even louder, and now it was accompanied by something else, a whisper so soft I couldn't make out words, but that carried the unmistakable cadence of human speech. I reached for the watch, intending to examine it more closely. But the moment my fingers touched the warm gold surface, the room around me disappeared. I was standing in the same preparation room, but it was different. Older, shabbier, lit by gas lamps instead of electric lights. The equipment was primitive, the tools crude compared to modern standards, and there was another man working at the table, dressed in a black suit that belonged to another era. He looked up as I appeared, and I saw my own face staring back at me, but aged, weathered, marked by decades of dealing with death. This other version of myself nodded as if he'd been expecting me. "You found it," he said, his voice exactly like mine but rougher, more tired. "The watch. It's been waiting for you." "I don't understand," I said, though somehow I did. This was me but not me. Another embalmer, in another time, connected to this pocket watch by forces I couldn't comprehend. "The Merchant family," he continued, never stopping his work on the body before him. "They've been dying for generations, each one bringing that watch back to us. Each time it shows us something we need to see." He gestured to the body on his table, and I realized it was another Harold Merchant, younger but with the same sharp features, the same air of authority even in death. This one was Harold's grandfather, my other self explained. Died in 1924, clutching that watch to his chest. Before him, it was his father, then his father's father, all the way back to the original owner, Josiah Merchant, who commissioned the watch in 1847. The room shifted around us, years flowing backward like water, and I saw them all, generations of merchant men, each one dying alone, each one grasping that golden timepiece as if it were the only thing tethering them to life. What does it want? I asked. To show you the truth, the other Robert said. About time, about death, about the prices we pay for the choices we make. The vision changed again, and I was watching Josiah Merchant in his study, a young man in his 30s examining the pocket watch by candlelight. He was speaking to someone I couldn't see, his voice filled with desperate hunger. You promise it will give me more time? He was saying. All the time I need to build my empire, to secure my family's future. A voice answered from the shadows, too deep, too resonant to be entirely human. Time is a commodity like any other. You can purchase as much as you require. The price is negotiable. What price? Each generation will pay a portion. Your son will live 70 years instead of 80. His son, 65 instead of 75, and so on until the debt is satisfied. And if I refuse? Then you die tomorrow, as fate originally intended. The fever will take you and your family will die in poverty. I watched Josiah consider the offer, weighing his own mortality against his descendants' futures. The choice, when it came, was inevitable. I accept. The shadow voice laughed, a sound, like grinding stone. Then wind the watch, Josiah Merchant. Wind it well, for it will measure every borrowed moment. Josiah wound the watch, and it began to tick. That same steady, relentless rhythm I'd been hearing for hours. But with each tick, I could see years being subtracted from his future lineage, borrowed time being redistributed across generations. The vision shifted forward through the years, showing me Harold's great-grandfather dying at 65, his grandfather at 60, his father at 55. Each death came exactly when the watch decreed, no earlier, no later. And with each passing generation, the survivors grew more isolated, more bitter, more aware that they were paying for their ancestors' bargain, but powerless to break it. Harold himself had lived to 93, but at what cost? I saw him as a young man watching his father die decades too early. I saw him decide never to marry, never to have children, determined to be the last of the merchant line so the curse would die with him. But the watch had other plans. The final vision showed me Harold's last moments, alone in his mansion, the pocket watch in his trembling hands. He was trying to break it, smashing it against the floor, trying to shatter the face, destroy the mechanism that had controlled his family for generations. But the watch was unbreakable, untouchable, protected by the same dark forces that had created it. It's over, Harold wheezed, his 93-year-old voice barely audible. I'm the last. The line ends with me. But the watch's ticking grew louder, more insistent, and in its rhythm Harold heard a terrible truth. The debt wasn't paid. There were still years owed, borrowed time that had to be returned. And if the merchant family couldn't pay it, someone else would have to. I snapped back to reality, still standing over Harold's body in the preparation room, but now I understood why the watch was still running, why it had shown me those visions. It was looking for a new family to bind, a new lineage to control. It was looking at me. The ticking grew louder, more demanding, and I felt an almost irresistible urge to wind the watch, to accept whatever bargain it offered. More time, more years, all the borrowed moments I could desire. All I had to do was reach out and take what was being offered. But I'd seen what that bargain cost. I'd watched generations of merchantmen die alone, their lives shortened to pay for their ancestors' greed. I'd seen Harold's bitter isolation, his desperate final attempt to break free from a curse that had shaped his entire existence. I would not become the next link in that chain. Instead, I did something Harold couldn't do. I removed the watch from his vest pocket and carried it outside to the small courtyard behind the funeral home. There, in the cold night air, I dug a hole 3 feet deep and placed the watch at the bottom. As I covered it with earth, the ticking grew frantic, desperate, like a heart in its final moments. The golden glow flickered and dimmed, and I could swear I heard Josiah Merchant's voice crying out in anguish as his bargain finally crumbled to dust. The ticking stopped. Harold's funeral proceeded without incident. He was buried in his family plot, free at last from the burden that had controlled his bloodline for over a century. The pocket watch remained buried behind the funeral home, its power broken, its appetite finally satisfied by the ending of the Merchant line. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone, I can still hear it. A faint ticking sound coming from beneath the earth, growing weaker with each passing day. The watch is dying, its mechanism slowly grinding to a halt now that it has no more time to steal. I've never told anyone about that night, about the visions or the choice I made. Some secrets are too dangerous to share, some knowledge too terrible to pass on. But I keep a close eye on the courtyard, watching for any sign that the watch might be trying to resurface. Because I learned something that Harold never understood. Time isn't something you can steal or borrow or buy. It's a gift precious because it's limited, meaningful because it ends. And anyone who tries to cheat death by robbing the future will find that some debts can never truly be paid. The dead don't always rest in peace, but sometimes if we're brave enough to break the chains that bind them, we can give them the ending they deserve. I've been running Whispering Pines Funeral Home for 8 years, ever since my father passed and left me the family business. 3 generations of my family have served this community, helping people say goodbye to their loved ones with dignity and grace. I thought I understood the weight of that responsibility, the sacred trust placed in our hands when families bring us their dead. I was wrong about so many things. The mirror came to us with Vivian Ashford, a 96-year-old woman who had been the last resident of the old Ashford estate. She'd lived alone for 20 years after her husband's death, rattling around in that massive house with only her memories for company. When she died peacefully in her sleep, her great-nephew Michael inherited everything: the house, the furniture, and decades of accumulated possessions. Aunt Vivian was very specific about this, Michael told me as he carried in an ornate hand mirror wrapped in black velvet. She wanted to be buried with her grandmother's mirror, said it was the most important thing she owned. The mirror was extraordinary, clearly an antique, probably from the late 1800s. The handle was sterling silver, elaborately carved with roses and thorns that seemed to shift and move in the light. The glass itself was perfect, without the cloudiness or spots you'd expect from something so old. When I held it up, my reflection looked back at me with startling clarity, as if the mirror could see deeper than just the surface. "It's beautiful," I said, running my fingers over the intricate silver work. "She must have treasured it." Michael nodded, but his expression was troubled. "She did. Sometimes I think she loved that mirror more than she loved people. She'd spend hours looking into it, talking to herself, or at least I thought she was talking to herself." There was something in his voice, a hesitation that made me look up from the mirror. "What do you mean?" "Probably nothing. Aunt Vivian was old, you know? Sometimes old people get confused, start seeing things that aren't there. But she always insisted there was someone else in the mirror, someone she called the lady. She'd have full conversations with her, ask her opinion about things, even argue with her sometimes." He shrugged, clearly embarrassed by the admission. The home health aide said it wasn't unusual for elderly people to develop imaginary companions. Helps with the loneliness. I nodded understandingly, though something about the mirror made me uncomfortable. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just a feeling that I was being watched, evaluated, judged by something I couldn't see. That evening, as I prepared Vivian's body for viewing, I placed the mirror beside her in the casket. She looked peaceful, her white hair carefully arranged, her hands folded over her chest. The mirror rested against her side, its silver handle gleaming under the soft lights of the viewing room. But as I adjusted the mirror's position, my reflection caught in its surface for just a moment, and what I saw made my blood freeze. There was someone else in the mirror. Not clearly, not obviously, but a shadow behind my shoulder, a suggestion of movement where there should have been none. I spun around, my heart hammering, but the room was empty. Just me, Vivian's body, and the rows of empty chairs waiting for tomorrow's service. I turned back to the mirror, studying my reflection carefully. This time I saw nothing unusual, just my own face, pale and worried, staring back at me. But I could swear I felt eyes on me, a presence watching from somewhere just beyond the glass. I should have removed the mirror then. Should have found some excuse to take it away, to suggest that family jewelry was better kept for the living than buried with the dead. But Vivian had been so specific about her wishes, and Michael had been so insistent about honoring them. So I left the mirror where it was. The viewing the next day was sparsely attended. Vivian had outlived most of her friends, and her family was small and scattered. But those who came seemed drawn to the mirror. They would lean in to pay their respects, and their eyes would inevitably drift to the antique piece resting beside her. Mrs. Chen, one of Vivian's former neighbors, stared at the mirror for a long time before straightening up with a puzzled expression. "That's odd," she murmured to her husband. For just a moment I could have sworn I saw someone else in there, a young woman with dark hair. Her husband chuckled gently. "It's just the angle, dear, the way the light hits the glass." But I saw Mrs. Chen glance back at the mirror several more times during the service, her brow furrowed with confusion, and something that might have been fear. After the funeral, as I prepared to close the casket for burial, I took one last look at Vivian's peaceful face. The mirror lay beside her, and in its surface I could see the ceiling lights, the flowers, my own reflection leaning over the casket. And behind my reflection, clear as day, stood a young woman with dark hair and hollow eyes. I slammed the casket, lid shut so hard it echoed through the chapel. That night I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I tried to rationalize it, tricks of light, stress, the power of suggestion after Mrs. Chen's comment. But I knew what I'd witnessed, and no amount of logical explanation could make it feel less real. I drove to the cemetery after midnight, using my master key to let myself into the office where I could access the burial records. If there was something supernatural about that mirror, if it was connected to the Ashford family in some way, there might be clues in the old files. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. The Ashford family had been burying their dead in Whispering Pines Cemetery for over a century, and the burial records told a disturbing story. Vivian's grandmother, Margaret Ashford, had been buried with the same mirror in 1923. But 3 weeks after her burial, her grave had been found disturbed, not robbed, but opened from the inside, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Margaret's daughter Vivian's mother Helen had died in 1954, also buried with the mirror, also found with her grave disturbed exactly 3 weeks later. The pattern continued through every generation. Each woman was buried with the family mirror, and each grave was found opened from within after precisely 21 days. The cemetery. Management had chalked it up to settling soil, animals, even vandalism. But the record showed that it happened every single time, without exception. And now, Vivian was buried with that same mirror. I drove straight to her grave, my hands shaking, as I gripped the steering wheel. The headstone was simple, elegant, marking the final resting place of the last Ashford woman. The earth was still fresh from the burial, mounded slightly above the level of the surrounding grass. But as I stood there in the moonlight, I could swear I heard something from beneath the ground, a faint tapping sound like fingernails on glass, or like someone knocking on a mirror from the other side. Over the following days, I researched everything I could about antique mirrors, about objects that might carry supernatural properties. What I learned made me wish I'd never touched the thing. Mirrors, according to folklore, are doorways, thin places between our world and whatever lies beyond. Antique mirrors, especially those that have been in families for generations, can become conduits for spirits who refuse to move on. They trap souls, hold them in a liminal space between life and death, using the reflective surface as a window back into the world they've lost. But this mirror was different. It wasn't just trapping the dead. It was using them. Each generation, of Ashford women had looked into that glass, had seen the spirit trapped within, and had eventually joined her. The mirror was collecting them, building a chorus of the dead who could never rest. And in 18 days, Vivian would try to join them. I knew I had to do something, but what? I couldn't dig up a grave on my own, couldn't desecrate a burial site based on supernatural theories and family legends. But I also couldn't let another soul be trapped in that cursed glass. The answer came to me on the 19th day, when I was cleaning out my father's old office and found his journal. He'd recorded everything during his 40 years as a funeral director, unusual requests, strange occurrences, things that couldn't be explained by conventional means. And there, in his careful handwriting, was an entry about Margaret Ashford's burial in 1923. The mirror troubles me. Mrs. Ashford's daughter, Helen, insists her mother be buried with it. Says it's a family tradition, but I've seen something in that glass, a darkness that doesn't belong in consecrated ground. If I could, I would refuse the request, but the family is adamant, and I have no grounds to deny them. I pray this decision doesn't come back to haunt us all. Below that entry, in different ink as if added later, was a single line. The silver can be broken. Shatter the mirror. Free the souls. On the 20th day, I returned to Vivian's grave with a sledgehammer. I waited until the deepest part of the night when the cemetery was empty and silent. The tapping from beneath the earth had grown louder, more insistent, accompanied now by what sounded like multiple voices calling out in languages I didn't recognize. I dug. For hours I dug, my hands blistering, my back aching, my clothes soaked with sweat and dirt. But I kept going, driven by the knowledge that tomorrow would be too late, that 21 days was some kind of deadline I couldn't afford to miss. At 4 a.m, my shovel struck the casket lid. I pried it open with trembling hands, expecting to find Vivian's body decomposed or missing or somehow changed. But she looked exactly as she had when I'd buried her. Peaceful, serene, her hands still folded over her chest. I pried it open with trembling hands, expecting to find Vivian's body decomposed or missing or somehow changed. But she looked exactly as she had when I'd buried her. Peaceful, serene, her hands still folded over her chest. The mirror, however, was different. The glass was no longer clear. Instead, it swirled with a dark, oily substance that moved like liquid mercury. And in that darkness I could see faces, women's faces, generations of Ashford women trapped in the glass, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes pleading for release. Vivian's face was among them now, recently added to the collection, her expression one of horror and betrayal as she realized what the family heirloom had done to her. I raised the sledgehammer and brought it down on the mirror with all my strength. The glass exploded in a shower of silver and shadow. The moment it shattered, the temperature in the cemetery plummeted, and I heard something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The sound of dozens of women's voices crying out in relief and gratitude as they were finally freed from their glass prison. The darkness that had swirled in the mirror dissipated like smoke, carrying with it the souls of every Ashford woman who had been trapped for over a century. They rose into the night sky like stars, ascending to whatever rest they had been denied for so long. Vivian's body crumbled to dust the moment the mirror broke, as if she had been held together only by the supernatural force that had claimed her. I reburied what remained, just her clothes and the empty casket, and filled in the grave. The next morning I called Michael to tell him that vandals had disturbed his aunt's grave, that we'd found evidence of grave robbing but that nothing of value had been taken. He was upset but philosophical. Vivian was gone, he said, and material possessions didn't matter in the end. He was right, though not in the way he thought. I kept the shattered pieces of the mirror, storing them in separate containers so they could never be reassembled. Sometimes I wonder if I should have them melted down, destroyed completely, but I worry that might risk releasing whatever dark force originally created the curse. So they remain locked away in my safe, a reminder of the responsibility we carry as guardians of the dead. not just to honor their wishes, but to protect them and the living from the things that should never have been made. The dead don't always rest in peace. But sometimes, if we're willing to shatter the chains that bind them, we can give them the freedom they've been denied. And sometimes that's the greatest gift we can offer, not just a dignified burial, but true release from the things that would keep them trapped between worlds forever. These stories have stayed with me, changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. Every object that comes through our doors now gets a second look, a careful examination for signs of something beyond the ordinary, because I've learned that the dead don't always take everything with them when they go. Sometimes they leave behind pieces of themselves, fragments of their souls embedded in the things they loved most, and those pieces are waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to inherit their terrible gifts. If you've made it this far, if these stories have reached into your chest and squeezed something deep inside, then you understand what I'm talking about. You've felt that chill, that recognition of truth in the darkness. Hit that like button if these tales have shown you something you needed to see. Subscribe to Dr. Bonechill, because there are more stories out there, more secrets buried with the dead, and some of us need to hear them to understand the world we're really living in. And tell me in the comments, what family heirloom sits in your home right now, gathering dust, carrying memories you've never questioned? Because after tonight, you might want to look at it a little closer. You might want to ask yourself what your grandmother really left you when she passed that. Lock it down through the generations. The dead speak to us through the objects they treasured. The question is, are you listening?
Thanks for joining me here at Dr. Bonechill. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, stay safe.